Hello, everyone. Welcome again to History's Lunch. My name is Drew Gardner, and we're excited to be in our home this week, the Craig H. Neilsen Auditorium here at the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. We're also streaming live on Facebook and YouTube, where you can watch any of our previous weeks. History's Lunch is available as well. I hope that you will join us for the 2025 Mississippi Makers Fest, a free music, food, and arts festival presented by Neilsen North America. This annual event will take place here at the two Mississippi museums on the Energy Plaza and in the surrounding area beginning at 10 a.m. on Saturday, May 10th. Because of that event, we will not have History's Lunch next Wednesday, but we will resume on May 14th. So, in preparation for that, there again will be no History's Lunch next Wednesday, May 7th, but we will be back in this room together on May 14th, where we'll get the pleasure of having Lawrence Strout from Mississippi State University, who will join us to present on the Gazebo Gazette, a post-Katrina triumph. But today we are delighted to welcome Jeffrey Boutwell to present George Boutwell, Hiding in Plain Sight. Jeffrey Boutwell is a writer, historian, and public policy specialist whose 40-year career spanned journalism, government, and international scientific research and cooperation. He has written widely on issues relating to nuclear weapons, arms control, European politics, Middle East security issues, and environmental degradation and civil conflict. He has a PhD in political science from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a BA in history from Yale University. He has worked for many years at the Academy of Arts and Sciences in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Jeffrey grew up in Winchester and Concord, Massachusetts, and now lives with his wife, Bethina Shokri, in Columbia, Maryland. He and George Boutwell, who is the subject of today's presentation, share a common ancestor, the indentured servant James Boutwell, who immigrated from England to Salem, Massachusetts in 1632. So please welcome Jeffrey Boutwell. Here we go.
Good. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Been giving many talks since the end of January when the book was published by W.W. Norton on George Boutwell. This is special for a number of reasons. One being, and I'll get into this later, George Boutwell's connection to Mississippi. As a senator in the 1870s, he led a Senate committee looking into the Mississippi Plan of 1875, and he came to both Jackson and Aberdeen, Mississippi, to take testimony from people who had been affected by the intimidation and the violence that went on during the elections of 1875. I was here 2 years ago. I met Brother Rogers, Jerry Nash, and I really appreciate their hospitality and making it possible for me to come back. But while I was here 2 years ago, to walk in both Jackson and Aberdeen, where George Boutwell had been, to stay in the hotel that he had stayed in 1876, when he came down here to take testimony, was a real thrill. So it's really very special and very meaningful for me to come back. Having said that, I always start off by asking people, how many of you had ever heard of George Boutwell before hearing word of this talk? Anybody? Ooh, we have a couple over there, okay. You're in good company because 99.9% of Americans had never heard of George Boutwell easily until this book. The percentages may only be a couple of percent now, but more people are beginning to hear about him. What I'd like to do today is to tell you why I think George was one of the most consequential public figures of the 1800s during Civil War, Reconstruction, the Gilded Age. He had a career of 65 years in public policy, and I'll go into that in explaining why I think he's one of the most consequential Americans that you've never heard of. But then even more importantly, I'll explain why you've never heard of him, or at least my reasons for believing that. And I'll go into the histories of the 20th century that ignored and dismissed him for many years, and why essentially he's been hiding in plain sight for so long. Then I'll talk a little bit about his connection to Mississippi, the Clinton massacre, and the report he did for the U.S. Senate in 1876. And I'll finish with why he's been kind of coming out of the shadows in the last 20 or 25 years, with a lot of new histories being written of Reconstruction, of the Andrew Johnson impeachment, which he had a big role in, of the Anti-Imperialist League at the end of his career that he worked on, essentially why George is becoming better known. So to start with why George is so consequential, very few American public figures can claim to have been intimately involved in American public life for 65 years. George began his career in the 1830s as an elected official in his hometown of Groton, Massachusetts. The first president he ever met was Martin Van Buren in 1839 and a visit to the White House. The last president he came face to face with was Teddy Roosevelt in 1904. From 1839 to 1904, George was involved in both Massachusetts politics and the national politics, and especially heavily involved with some of our most prominent and important presidents that we had in the 1800s. Certainly, most especially Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant, which I'll get into in terms of how George worked with both of them in their administrations in the 1860s and 1870s. But of course, he also had a deep connection to Andrew Johnson, being one of the impeachment managers against Johnson when Johnson was impeached in the 1860s for what George felt was Johnson's attempt to overturn the results of the Civil War and deny equality of rights to both blacks and whites in the South. And then at the end of his career, Teddy Roosevelt and the whole issue of the annexation of the Philippines, which I'll get into as well. So the longevity of his career is 65 years, and George, very much a flinty Yankee farmer, in good health almost all of his life, just kept his nose to the grindstone on any issue. He was a workaholic. He just did not want to be absent from public life for any length of time. So, length of his career is one thing. The diversity of his experience, I think, is even more impressive. As I'll explain in this talk, George Boutwell was equally proficient in domestic policy and civil rights, economic policy and finance, and foreign affairs. Very briefly, domestic policy and civil rights, working with Lincoln and Grant on the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Economic policy and finance, George was Lincoln's Commissioner of Revenue in the early 1860s, and then Grant's Secretary of the Treasury from 1869 to 1873. So 6 years of working with two presidents on America's fiscal and monetary policies at incredibly important times. And then finally, foreign affairs, that came late in George's career. He began to specialize in international law in the 1880s and 1890s. He was hired by the Kingdom of Hawaii to represent its interests before the U.S. Congress. There were disputes over the free importation of sugar from Hawaii, and Louisiana sugar producers wanted to get rid of that, and George represented Hawaii to make sure that sugar could come into the country duty-free in the 1880s. But even more important than that, of course, was his role as president of the Anti-Imperialist League following the Spanish-American War in 1898, by which he and other prominent Americans like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, the steel industrialist, Samuel Gompers, the labor leader, Jane Addams of Hull House, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington from the black community all came together to protest really what was America's first imperialist venture overseas in physically annexing the Philippines, sending American troops to quell Filipino independence struggle after the Spanish-American War. So, both the longevity of his career and the diversity of the issues that he was involved in. Who was George? Born to a modest farming family in Massachusetts in 1818. If there are any golfers here, I always like to mention there's a very prominent elitist golf club outside of Boston called the Country Club of Brookline. It's been the site of numerous U.S. Opens, Ryder Cup competitions. George Boutwell was born on the grounds of the Country Club of Brookline. The farmhouse he was born in 1818 is still part of the modern clubhouse of that country club today. Of course, back then it was all farming country. His father was managing a farm for a wealthy Boston landowner. A couple of years later, was able to save money and buy his own farm in central Massachusetts, in Lunenburg, Massachusetts. So George grew up as a farm boy, never went to school beyond the age of 10, worked the farm summers and winters. Early in his teens, he was apprenticed to a dry goods store. They would work from morning till night. After that, like Lincoln, very much like Lincoln, he would read until well into the morning. 2 o'clock in the morning, very much self-taught, but a voracious intellectual appetite, again like Lincoln, to read anything he could get his hands on. So George he comes from farming stock. His family were temperance. They were teetotalers. So it was very understandable that he would begin his political career first with the Temperance Party in Massachusetts, but then quickly realizing, well, that's not going to get me any elected positions, so he joined the Democrats soon after, served 7 terms in the Massachusetts House of Representatives in the 1840s, and then became the youngest ever governor of Massachusetts in 1851 through a coalition between the Democrats and the newly emerging Free Soil Party that was emerging to protest the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. So George becomes governor in the 1850s, but quickly realizes, as he's becoming more anti-slavery, of course, in Massachusetts, which is a hotbed of abolitionism, that he can't stomach remaining in the Democratic Party, which at the time is controlled by the Southern Democrats who were pro-slavery. So very quickly in 1853-54, he works with other politicians in Massachusetts to found the Republican Party in Massachusetts. That happens in 1854. He supports John Fremont, the first Republican nominee for president in 1856, and essentially helps build up the Republican Party throughout the 1850s, so that in 1860, he has the distinction of not only going to the National Convention in Chicago that nominates Lincoln, and of course is incredibly important, but George was chosen as one of 7 drafters of the Republican platform. He works with people like Horace Greeley, the New York editor, and others to craft the anti-slavery plank of the Republican platform in 1860, on which Lincoln will be elected. So George is coming to be better known among the Republican national figures at that time. And again, a little personal note and just a thrill that I've had in working on this, working on a book about a family member who shares my last name. After the convention in Chicago, George is one of a small group of Republican notables that goes to Springfield to meet with Lincoln and let him know that he's been nominated by the party. They go to Lincoln's house at 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield, Illinois, into Lincoln's parlor. They have a meeting with Lincoln. And a couple of years ago, when I was visiting that house, it was just a real thrill to stand in the parlor in Lincoln's house and think of how George Boutwell had stood there in May of 1860, shaking hands with Lincoln for the first time. So George is coming to know Lincoln better. Lincoln then appoints him as the country's first revenue commissioner in 1862. There was a very important tax act that year to raise money for the Union troops. Lincoln had famously said, the bottom is out of the tub. We don't have enough money to pay the soldiers and to support the Union war effort. So Congress passes a tax bill that includes a number of new excise and excise duties, but also for the first time in the country's history, an income tax, a personal income tax. It was a progressive income tax, graduated income tax. But George Boutwell, my relative, distant family relative, was responsible for implementing the country's very first income tax. And I always tell people, I hope they won't hold that against me, because it's a legacy that goes back to 1862. So George is really becoming better known in Washington and with Lincoln. And that's what really launches his career in Washington politics and especially in anti-slavery politics. George works at the Revenue Bureau for 8 months. He gets it up and running off the ground and is elected as a Massachusetts congressman in 1862 to take his seat in 1863. So now he's representing Massachusetts in Congress, working with people like Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, other radical Republicans who are kind of pushing Lincoln on a number of fronts. One, to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, to come out more in support of black equality, first emancipation, but then black civil equality after that. So George is very, very instrumental working with people like Stevens. He was a member of the Joint Committee on Reconstruction and the House Judiciary Committee, both of which were responsible for crafting the 14th and 15th Amendments. So George's penmanship is visible in those amendments. And he really launched the first salvo in the Andrew Johnson impeachment. There's a wonderful article that was published in the Atlantic Monthly in October of 1866 called The Usurpation, where George accuses Andrew Johnson of seeking to restore Southern white political control of Congress, which of course had been lost in 1860-61 with secession. Johnson is seeking to reintegrate Southern states with only minimal conditions by which they can regain or retake their seats in Congress, restore white governments in the South. And for people like George and Stevens and Sumner, this was not what the Civil War was fought about. There must be more stringent conditions by which Southern white governments would be held to account to provide equality and voting rights for newly freed black slaves in 1865-66. And George thinks Johnson is just trampling all over that concept, trying to institute what George called presidential restoration as opposed to congressional reconstruction to bring the country back together after the Civil War. So that's what he's doing for 6 years in the House of Representatives. Of course, Johnson was not convicted in the impeachment. It failed by one vote to get the necessary 2/3 majority. And many people said, well, then obviously it was a failure. People more and more are coming to realize, no, it wasn't necessarily a failure. The impeachment process really constrained Johnson for the last 12 to 15 months of his presidency in terms of interfering with the Congress's plan for Reconstruction. So that's 1863 to 69. In 1869, George fully expects to stay in Congress. He enjoys the legislature most of all. He enjoys crafting legislation, coalition building, all the stuff that goes on in the House and Senate. At the very last minute, though, just days before Ulysses Grant is inaugurated as president in March of 1869, Grant's first choice for Treasury Secretary, a wealthy New York department store owner, has to stand aside over conflicts of interest, and Grant turns to George and said, I'm in a real fix. I really need your help to step in and become my Secretary of the Treasury with only a few days to go. And of course, with his experience as Lincoln's Revenue Commissioner and also as Governor of Massachusetts, George does have the administrative and financial expertise to take on the Secretary's job, and proceeds to do a quite good excellent job or excellent effort at it for the next 4 years. And at a very important time when the United States is coming out of the Civil War, it's trying to get its economy back on track. It's got the problem of too many greenbacks, paper currency in circulation, inflation has to be brought down, and George helps kind of modulate the relationship of greenbacks to gold in the American economy by 1873 to get the American economy back on a sound footing. Also important, though, in those years was the fact that the Treasury Secretary had authority over the Secret Service. And the Secret Service, one of its main charges was infiltrating and trying to break up white supremacist groups in the South, and most especially the KKK. So George played a role in that, working with the Attorney General, Amos Ackerman, to disband and break up the white supremacist groups in the South who were intimidating and visiting violence upon both black citizens and their Republican allies in trying to carry out their constitutional duties of voting and citizenship. So even though his service as Secretary of the Treasury is mainly financial, it also continues to be involved in domestic affairs and civil rights. Then in 1873, George goes back into the U.S. Senate, where he wanted to be in the first place after 4 years as Grant's Secretary of the Treasury, and is instrumental in both the Civil Rights Act of 1875, but especially the 1876 Mississippi Report, which was kind of the last dying gasp of the radical Republicans before the end of Reconstruction, before the end of Grant's presidency in early 1877. And what that is all about, and I don't have to tell this audience, many here will know far more than I do about the Clinton Massacre and the Mississippi Plan of 1875, by which the Democratic Party sought to redeem Mississippi government from Republican Party. But in 1875, it really, of course, began before that in 1874 with violence in Vicksburg during local elections in Vicksburg. Grant had to send Sheridan or military commanders to reestablish control and stability in Vicksburg. But then especially the Clinton Massacre in September of 1875, whereby, a rally organized by the Republicans turns violent when some inebriated white Democrats start getting rowdy, and one thing leads to another, and before you know it, you have days and days of blacks and Republicans being hunted down in the woods around Clinton and murdered. So that all leads up to the county and state elections in 1875, by which the Democratic Party and its chairman, J.Z. George, and Lucius Lamar, who was a congressman at the time, helped to shift political power in Mississippi back to the Democrats. They won, I think, 5 out of 6 congressional seats. They won 80% of the seats in the Mississippi legislature, and essentially overturned Republican rule. They then drive the governor, Adelbert Ames, out of the state through threats of impeachment, and that's kind of the beginning of the end, certainly, of Reconstruction in Mississippi. Well, in 1876, George is, from his post on the Judiciary Committee, he's appointed to head up a Senate Select Committee of 5 members to come to Mississippi, take testimony about what had happened the year before. It starts in April of 1876. There are 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats on this Select Committee. They take testimony in Washington for several months. Then they make a trip down to Jackson and Aberdeen, as I mentioned, to take firsthand testimony from whites and blacks, Democrats and Republicans, about what had happened the year before with the campaign of intimidation and violence to overturn the elections of 1875. And George ends up overseeing the manufacture or the publication of a 2,000-page report on what had happened in Mississippi in 1875. It's a report that's easily available on the website. It makes for incredible kind of first-hand testimonial reading in terms of what had happened in 1875. I mentioned Frederick Douglass Emancipation Statue dedication only because that was just when the committee was getting started, and it's an interesting confluence that on the 11th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination in April of 1876, Frederick Douglass inaugurates a new statue, the Emancipation Group statue in Washington, D.C. Many of you, I'm sure, will know it. It's the one where Lincoln kind of has his hand outstretched over a kneeling enslaved man who is breaking his chains and beginning to rise from the being enslaved. And Douglass gives a very, very kind of blunt, controversial speech about how, yes, Lincoln did help emancipate the slaves, but he was the white man's president. He was not the black man's president. And Douglass really makes a case for the concept of what we're familiar with today of black agency. The blacks were just not the passive recipients of emancipation. It was not given to them by Lincoln or by the white power structure, but through the Underground Railroad, through violent resistance, through many, many different means. In the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, blacks had worked for their emancipation from slavery. So George is sitting on the platform there, just a few feet behind Frederick Douglass, when Douglass is giving that quite remarkable speech. George got in touch with Douglass a few days later to say it was one of the most remarkable speeches I've ever heard. I enjoy reading it aloud to my family on a regular basis. It's something they need to hear. And it was just a few days after that dedication in Washington that George opened the hearings on Capitol Hill into the Mississippi Plan of 1875. First witness was Adelbert Ames, who now, of course, is back up in the North. They, as I mentioned, go down to Jackson and Aberdeen in June of 1876 to take first-hand testimony. The report itself is publicized on the floor of the Senate in August of 1876. It's the culmination of 6 months of intense work, 2,000 pages long. George delivers the report to the full Senate on the Senate floor in August of 1876, and essentially nobody cares. Senators don't care, the press doesn't care, most Northern whites don't care. Reconstruction is coming to an end. Northern whites have Reconstruction fatigue. They're tired of having to support military interventions in the South to protect black rights. They're really coming around to the credo of, let the South control its own affairs. We're tired of this. It's the centenary of the American Revolution, 1876. They want to celebrate the country's 100th anniversary. They want to look forward to what America can do in the future, and they're just tired of all of the controversies over Reconstruction. So George delivers the report. It's a very important historical document, and we're glad it exists today, but it didn't make much of a splash at the time. Even Northern newspapers kind of poo-pooed it and said, this is old news, we're tired of hearing about these reports of violence in the South. So that's George's really remarkable 14 years in Washington. From 1862, when he begins as Lincoln's Revenue Commissioner, to 1877, when he finishes his term in the U.S. Senate. There are no other American public figures who really were there for that entire time and were constantly fighting for America's vision of a multiracial society, of fighting for equal rights, voting rights, and whatnot. People like Thaddeus Stevens had died, Joel Sumner had died, others like Horace Greeley or Carl Schurz, who had been very strong proponents of black rights up to and during the Civil War. They've given up the ghost. They've moved on to other issues, and in some cases they've even turned against Reconstruction and are anti-Ulysses Grant's efforts to protect black rights in the South. So George is incredibly consequential for those 14 years. I've explained other reasons why I think he's so important, and therefore the $60,000 question is, well, great, if he's so important, why isn't he better known? Why has nobody ever heard of him? When I first finally found a literary agent to help me with my book, and it took about 25 tries, sending out 25 proposals and getting turned down 25 times, the first question she asked me was, okay, great, you think George is important, and you've convinced me. I think he's important too and delivers to be better known to the American people, but why isn't he better known? You've really got to set down your arguments logically and comprehensively in terms of why George has not been better known, isn't better known after 150 years. So these are the arguments that I come up with. One is his personality. This is a minor argument, but George was a flinty Yankee, not the warmest of creatures, didn't get along with his colleagues all that well necessarily. Most importantly, he wasn't a showboat. He wasn't someone who, with an outsized personality who sought the limelight. If you think of people like Charles Sumner and the speeches he gave in Congress, or Benjamin Butler, people like that, Thaddeus Stevens even, George kind of preferred to remain in the background, work on legislation, and get the job done. He also suffered by his background as a Massachusetts farmer. Of course, Boston being the hotbed of Boston Brahmin elites at the time, people like the Lodges and Cabots and the Adams family all kind of disdained George Boutwell with his plebeian roots as a part of a Massachusetts farming family. And that's most especially true for Henry Adams, and the very important The Education of Henry Adams that he wrote in 1905, 1910, where Henry Adams is just scathing in his criticism both of George Boutwell but also of Ulysses S. Grant. Adams had been passed over for political positions in the Grant administration, and he took it out in spades with his criticism of Grant and Boutwell in the years to come. And, as many historians will say, Adams really helped set the tone for much of 20th century history and how Ulysses Grant especially was seen and how Grant's presidency was seen. As we all know, for most of the 20th century, Grant was seen as one of our worst presidents. Some people ranked him down there with Warren G. Harding. He was a drunk, he was a neophyte, he was a political, inept, corrupt, nepotistic president who did not deserve to be recognized for what he did. So George suffered from all of that kind of disdain from Boston elites, disdain from Henry Adams, and disdain from American historians. More importantly, though, than his personality, George was seen as being on the losing side in several major episodes of American history. Mentioned briefly the Johnson impeachment. For many years, that was seen as an unconstitutional overreach of power on the part of radical Republicans who had no business lodging bills of impeachment against Andrew Johnson. That view has changed over time. The Grant administration, I've just mentioned, recent biographies and works by people like Charles Calhoun on the presidency of Ulysses Grant have really brought Grant's presidency into a much more positive light. So George has suffered from his association with Grant. The anti-imperialist campaign. Imagine, if you will, it's 1898. Teddy Roosevelt embodies the red-blooded America that is, striding onto the world stage. America has just made short work of the decrepit Spanish Empire. Dewey has sailed into Manila Bay and sunk the Spanish fleet. America is really flexing its muscles and kind of promoting manifest destiny on the world stage. And here are these old fogies from the 1900s, 1800s, George Boutwell, even Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie. What business do they have of trying to deny America its place on the stage through its annexation of the Philippines, its control of Cuba, which of course lasted up until the 1950s. So George suffered from American historians as well in being the president of this anti-imperialist league and trying to go up against Teddy Roosevelt. Finally, and most importantly though, and this really trumps all of the other considerations, is the triumph of lost cause historiography in American academic writing for most of the 20th century. The fact that American historians, led by the Dunning School of Columbia, but many others, were promoting the concept that the South had been unfairly treated after the Civil War, that Reconstruction had been imposed on the point of bayonets that Ulysses Grant had sent down south to enforce civil rights in the South, and that really was the dominant motif in American academic and historical writing for most of the 20th century. But not just in academic writing, it was also the dominant motif in cultural and social life in America. Birth of a Nation is only the most obvious example of how that theme of lost cause, Southern lost cause, was propagated for most of the 20th century, not only in movies, but in books. The Klansman by Thomas Dixon and others, which was the source of Birth of a Nation. But even in advertising, even things as kind of benign as Gone with the Wind tried to promote toward the American people, the image of a bucolic antebellum South that after the Civil War was terribly untreated by the North, by the carpetbaggers that came down, and by people like George Boutwell, who was described by one Dunning disciple, a guy named Benjamin Kendrick, as the most fanatic and radical of them all. Just cold-hearted. All he wanted to do was crush the South under the heel of his boot. That was his only motivation for all of the work he did in Congress. Well, as I said, that motif or that theme has been changing over the last 25 years with these new histories. Brenda Wineapple on the Johnson impeachment. These are only just a few of many, many works that have come out in the last 20 to 25 years that are giving new interpretation of the events that went on at that time, all of which George Boutwell had a signal role in. Johnson impeachment, Grant presidency, anti-imperialism, and Reconstruction. And I'll end this little segment by talking about the last name on that list, Benjamin Quarles. Benjamin Quarles was a prominent African-American historian who in 1933 arrives at the University of Wisconsin to do his graduate work. And he tells his thesis advisor, he's got a master's thesis to do first, that he wants to write about the concept of Black agency. He wants to focus on Black life in America, contributions of Blacks to the progress or the evolution of American society and politics. He wants to write about the Black experience in America. Well, one of his thesis advisors, or the one he had at first, said, sorry, you can't do that. Not a good idea. Reasons given are there isn't enough primary source material to write about Black life in America. 2, we're not sure that Black can be objective in writing about other Blacks. Incredibly condescending, paternalistic strictures he's getting from his thesis advisor at Wisconsin, and he literally is prevented from writing about a Black figure for his master's thesis. So what does Benjamin Quarles do? Well, this just absolutely floored me when I learned about it, and it's one of the most satisfying things that I learned during the research of this book. Quarles looks around for a white politician, I believe, who best epitomized the concept of Black agency, and he settles on George Boutwell. Benjamin Quarles wrote a wonderful 120-page master's thesis on George Boutwell called George Boutwell, a Radical with Reasons, that looked very deeply at Boutwell's work with the Joint Committee on Reconstruction from about 1866 to 69, all of the work George did on the 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, the Johnson impeachment. Quarles writes about George Boutwell as a kind of a proponent and a hero of Black agency. This at a time when the dominant historical narrative in the country, of course, is on lost cause historiography. So Quarles, to put it mildly, is very much going against the grain in terms of writing about George Boutwell. Finally, when his next thesis advisor relents and says, yes, you can do your PhD thesis on Frederick Douglass, thank you very much, Quarles publishes his thesis in, I think, 1940, and then publishes the first major biography of Douglass in 1948. And there's a wonderful story that I came across when I was doing work at the Quarles Archive at Morgan State University, which is right near Baltimore, going through his papers. In the 1980s, there's a young graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, his same alma mater, the same institution he had been at in the 1930s, who writes to him and says, Dear Professor Quarles, I would very much like to do my PhD thesis on Frederick Douglass, and I'd like you to look at the précis I've written up, and if you can give me some thoughts and comments on it, I'd be really appreciative. That young graduate student was David Blight, who then goes on to write a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Frederick Douglass, came out 5-6 years ago. Letters from David Blight in the 1980s to Benjamin Quarles, writing from Wisconsin to Morgan State University, kind of reliving all that Quarles had gone through in the 1930s at the University of Wisconsin in terms of being prevented about writing about Black subjects. Quarles died in 1999, I believe. I never got a chance to meet him, but I certainly would have loved to have. So that essentially is, why I believe George was consequential, why he's been ignored and dismissed for so long, why he's now coming back into vogue. But the truth was that up until the book that I wrote came out in January, there'd only been 2 even moderate length treatments of him. One was a modest biography written in the 1980s published by the Groton Historical Society in Groton, Mass. And then, of course, the other one, the thesis by Benjamin Quarles. I didn't get too much into George's family life in Groton, the fact that he had a farm in addition to serving in Congress and whatnot, a remarkable relationship he had with his daughter, Georgiana, who spent a lot of time with him in Washington, the remarkable relationship he had with Ulysses Grant, meeting Grant for the first time in 1864 when Grant comes to Washington to get his commission as Lieutenant General from Abraham Lincoln, up to 1885 when George is one of the pallbearers for Ulysses Grant's funeral on the streets of New York that was witnessed by 1.5 million people in August of 1885. So other wonderful stories, family stories that I could go into, but I'll keep it at that and we can take some questions.
I'll bring the microphone to you.
A couple years ago, the business writer Roger Lowenstein wrote a book called Ways and Means about how the Union successfully financed its war effort, and the Confederacy didn't. So I'll look at that again. I reckon George is in the book.
Well,
or maybe not.
That's part of my pet peeve. I don't think George's name appears at all in that book. Here's a Commissioner of Revenue working with Salmon Chase and Abraham Lincoln in 1862-63 to raise the needed funds for the Union war effort. I think Roger kind of refers a couple of times to the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, but he never mentions George's name. And to me, well, that's part of why I wrote this book, that there were other aspects to the story that other people have not picked up on. But it's a great book because it does explain especially why the North was so successful in raising needed funds, but by the same token, why the South was so handicapped by its inability to tax its citizens and to raise the revenue it needed for the Confederate war effort.
They didn't sell the cotton crop in 1860 by keeping it off the market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we heard a presentation on the Mississippi State University Presidential Library of Grant. Have you visited the Grant and have seen the effort to reconcile Mississippi's version of Grant as well as the overall representation of Grant that you said was pretty askance for a long time? Have you had a chance to go up there and see what they're doing?
I was there 2 years ago, met with Ann Marshall and Ryan Semmes, who oversee the Grant papers there. There wasn't a lot of personal papers there or personal, effects between Grant and Boutwell. Most of those are up in Groton, Massachusetts, at the Governor Boutwell House as part of his papers. I do remember spending about 3 hours going through maybe 640 memos between Grant and Boutwell when he was Secretary of the Treasury, all of which had to deal with appointing a tax collector, appointing an assessor, congressional legislation, but they all had to be gone through just to make sure that there was nothing there that I might not want to use in the book. But I love the library. It's really thrilling to know that a new facility is being built up there and will be open in the next few years. And of course, I love the story of how the Grant Presidential Library came to be at Mississippi State in the first place, when it used to be at Southern Illinois University. I won't tell the story, but I always have to think that the people at Southern Illinois University are kicking themselves for having let that presidential library get away to Mississippi State.
Yes, I have a question on foreign affairs. That the major foreign affairs policy during the Civil War was preventing England from recognizing the South and instead recognizing the North. What was Boutwell's role in that?
Nothing really direct. As a member of Congress, of course, the Senate has influence on foreign affairs, so he was a member of the House. They didn't concern themselves so much with U.S. policy towards England. He played a minor role on a couple of occasions. The U.S. minister in England was Charles Francis Adams, and of course from Massachusetts, and someone George knew well, and he helped kind of act as a go-between between Adams and Lincoln at various times. the more important role he played, and I didn't get into this at all, and to me it's one of the great stories in the book. George gave a very important speech on August 6, 1862, at what was known as the Great War Rally on Capitol Hill. 10,000 people coming together for a rally designed to improve Union morale, because of course in the summer of 1862, the war is going very badly. McClellan is retreating from the Virginia Peninsula again. There are sick and wounded all over Washington. And there's a rally held that Lincoln is at, along with Chase and others sitting up on the platform. There are 10 speakers that day. All the speakers, without exception, except for George Boutwell, talk about restoring the Union, and that's the primary war aim, because it was too soon to talk about emancipation. Lincoln was moving in that direction, but he couldn't yet come out in a public way and advocate for emancipation of the 4 million enslaved blacks in the South, because Northern public opinion wasn't quite ready for it. But George Boutwell could, as a member of his administration, having deniability, not necessarily speaking for the president, but he's delivering a message for the president. And he says it in no uncertain terms: slavery is the cause of the war, emancipation will be the solution. The faster that the president and the administration recognize that and move to emancipation, move to enlisting blacks in the Union Army, the sooner the war will be over. Well, this played extremely well in the American press. All over the North, newspapers lauded Boutwell for saying what they said many other people should be saying but aren't saying, that this war isn't just about restoring the Union as it was, it's about eradicating slavery. And so not only in Northern newspapers, black African-American newspapers, but I was amazed and kind of gratified to discover it played extremely well in Britain. Newspapers in London and Leeds and Liverpool all reported on George Boutwell's speech at this rally in Washington, D.C., applauding him for talking about emancipation as a necessary war aim for the Union. And of course, as you say, at the time, it was very much kind of a touch-and-go issue as to whether England might recognize the South. And of course, the political dynamics in England were that the cotton mill owners and the wealthy landowners wanted to recognize the South, but English public opinion, the common man, was very much anti-slavery, or primarily anti-slavery. And that was a counterpoint to the English industrialists and the people who benefited from the cotton trade of recognizing the South. So even in that respect, George's speech in Washington had a small role to play in kind of igniting English public opinion to make sure that England did not recognize the Confederacy.
Thank you for that very informative presentation. Thank you. I'm just wondering about what was George's position on the South when things about the Mississippi Constitution of 1890, introducing segregation. What about his position on segregation and Jim Crow laws? Those kind of things. I was wondering what position George was on those kinds of things concerning the South and racism. Thank you.
George had two major passions in life. One was voting rights for all Americans, not just blacks, but Asian, Chinese immigrants, people who had attained American citizenship should be allowed to vote. And in that respect, he played a small role in crafting the birthright citizenship component of the first section of the 14th Amendment, even though John Bingham is rightly credited with being the primary author. But George had a passion for voting rights and for public education. That actually started earlier in Massachusetts. For several years, George Boutwell was chair of the Massachusetts Board of Education, promoting public education for all, for women as well, the so-called normal schools in the 1850s, by which women could get an education and become teachers, even before the Civil War. So when it came to emancipation, when it came to Reconstruction, George Boutwell, as much as anyone, constantly talked about we need two primary vehicles by which blacks can become, full citizens in this country. One is voting rights, one is education. George worked with James Garfield to establish the Department of Education in the late 1860s. Fortunately, it was never given all the resources and the authority it needed, but George would make the argument that public education is in everybody's interest, poor white as well as poor black. Of course, before the Civil War, public education in the South had not really existed. It was only for the well-to-do in terms of tutors on the plantations and whatnot. Very little public expenditures, if at all, were given to public education in the South before the Civil War. And so afterward, George says we need public education, for all citizens, black, white, Asian, immigrant, German, Irish, whatever, because that's what will, meld the American multiracial promise together most effectively.
I think this is very interesting. I have two thoughts. One is that the debate about why Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The two arguments that you made. One for, one argument is that he was not really concerned about the slaves, that he recognized that it was important to save the Union. But my second question is, with a lot of the information that you're giving here sounds like DEI. And under the current administration, do you think at all that your book might be placed on the ban list?
I can't go into details, but I've already run afoul of that with a talk that was going to be sponsored by a government organization. Fortunately, it all turned out well in the end. I was able to give the talk. But that was raised as an issue. So yes, it's, just calling the book Radical Republican, I think kind of gets people's attention. Even though, of course, Radical Republican in the 1860s has a totally different connotation than it does today. In terms of Lincoln, do we have about 5 hours to talk about Lincoln's views on social equality, civil equality, emancipation, citizenship? It's an ongoing historical debate. It's a really fascinating one. I tend to believe that Lincoln was waiting for public opinion to move in the right direction so that he could issue the Emancipation Proclamation, as he initially did in September of 1862, to be formalized on January 1st, 1863. Was Lincoln at that time totally supportive of black social equality? No, I don't believe so. Most whites weren't. I'm not even sure George Boutwell was entirely. They were kind of working their way along, groping their way along to get out of slavery, effect emancipation, give them political rights, give them citizenship, and then we'll proceed from there with education and other, with being able to compete fairly in the labor market and whatnot. I do believe, though, that Lincoln was not resistant to emancipation. Many people have talked about, well, he had his colonization schemes, he had his compensation schemes. He really wasn't in favor. All he wanted to do was, free the blacks and send them off to the Caribbean or to Liberia. I think that was all part of his strategy to kind of work around the difficulties of Northern public opinion, which, as I said, were really resistant to emancipation, even in 1862-63. Think of the New York City draft riots in the summer of 1863, and the number of blacks who were killed on the streets of New York when white immigrants and Democrat copperheads were running around against the war effort. Anyway, I think Lincoln was much more pro-emancipation than some people have given him credit for. And that was one of the joys of writing the book. George met with Lincoln quite often. Because he worked in the Treasury building as Commissioner of Revenue, it was a short walk to the White House. He met with Lincoln on a number of occasions. He also met with Lincoln at the War Office when they were both checking the telegrams of what was happening on the war front. And there were some good conversations there about, George feeling that Lincoln is, much further along than many people give him credit for in terms of emancipation, and thus wasn't surprised when finally the so-called victory at Antietam, or at least a standoff at Antietam, allowed Lincoln to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation.
Thanks for that talk, Jeffrey. Really enjoyed that. Right, just me. Kind of to follow up on that question, I wondered if there's a whole cottage industry about African Americans' interactions with Abraham Lincoln from Douglas on down, coming to the White House, et cetera. And so I've always been struck, especially with the Mississippi Report of '76, with Boutwell's passion and how intensely he took those interviews and those interrogations. But one thing I couldn't really find out is what kind of interactions were you able to find out that Boutwell had with African Americans? Did he have any personal relationships with them, any correspondence, either during Reconstruction or earlier, and that you were able to find? And what do you think that does or doesn't tell us about his principles?
That's a great question. I was never able to find as much as I hoped I would in terms of George's interactions with blacks. There were free blacks living in Groton, Massachusetts. Now, for those who don't know, Groton is a lovely colonial town just west of Concord, Massachusetts, about 40 miles west of Boston, where George lived almost his entire life, 70 years, where all of his papers are in his house. There were free blacks in Groton. He did interact with those. He first came across Frederick Douglass in the early 1840s, when Douglass came to Groton 3 times in the space of a couple of years to give anti-slavery lectures as part of the whole circuit that Frederick Douglass was on throughout the North for the anti-slavery societies. George worked with people like William Still in Philadelphia, prominent black abolitionist, with Douglass. At the end of his life, and it's really a nice kind of anecdote as well, in 1903, in Boston, Massachusetts, you had something called the Great Emancipation Meeting, held on January 1st, 1903, the 40th anniversary of Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, of course, at this time, you have Jim Crow, you have absolute retreat in black civil rights throughout the country, not just in the South, but North as well. Racist pockets in Boston and New York and many other cities. So George works with a prominent black newspaperman, William Monroe Trotter, to organize a Great Emancipation meeting in Faneuil Hall. Equally black and white audience comes to celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation during a day of commemoration. And George was 85 years old when he was asked to be the primary speaker at that meeting. So he worked certainly professionally and politically with these people in terms of personal relationships. I was never able to find as much as I had hoped, partly because George never kept a diary. Unlike many people like Salmon Chase and Gideon Wells and others who kept detailed diaries of what was going on day to day, George didn't keep a diary, so I never quite knew what his personal relationships were with individual blacks.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit more about the indentured servant who was an ancestor? How he got to be an indentured servant, how he obtained his freedom, and what kind of impact may have that had on his thinking?
I'd never thought about that aspect of it before. James Boutwell came to Massachusetts in 1832 as an indentured servant. That was very common at the time for poor English whites who wanted to flee Britain and come to the New World, but didn't have the money to pay for a transatlantic passage. They would contract with a wealthy farmer, landowner, whatnot, to have their passage paid, in return for which they would work for several years to pay off that debt. And that's what James Boutwell did in 1832, comes to Salem, Massachusetts, gains his freedom by 1838, having worked off his debt for being able to come over to America, and then goes into farming, and that's what led to the whole kind of Boutwell family farming inheritance or genealogy in New England. In terms of what impact that might have had on George, he never kind of mentions it explicitly. I think the most important impact is really just the modest roots as a farming family. Tilling Massachusetts soil, not the most productive in the country, concentrating on fruit trees and cattle and whatnot. It was his very modest upbringing in a farming family with very little at home to, very little in the way of luxuries that conditioned his upbringing in terms of providing equality of opportunity for all Americans in terms of being able to get ahead.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the top of another hour of History is Lunch. Let's give Jeffrey another round of applause.
Thank you very much.
We will have Jeffrey's book, Boutwell, for sale. He'll be able to sign a copy for you if you would like. Remember, there will be no History is Lunch next week, but we will be back in this room on May 14th for Larry Strauss for the Gazebo Gazette, a post-Katrina triumph. So thank you so much for being here. Let's give Jeffrey one last round of applause.
Thanks very much.